Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer. Quotes. Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer is a collection of essays that encapsulate his deeply pessimistic worldview, reflecting on the futility and suffering inherent in human existence. Schopenhauer explores themes such as the inevitability of pain, the vanity of life, the nature of death, and the limitations of human happiness. His essays offer a critical view of life's transitory pleasures and emphasize the inevitability of suffering due to the insatiable nature of human desires. Schopenhauer's perspective, influenced by Eastern philosophies and his own metaphysical theories, provides readers with a stark, unflinching look at the darker aspects of life. Through a combination of philosophical argument and vivid examples, Schopenhauer articulates a worldview that sees suffering as central to the human condition, ultimately advocating for a path of asceticism and the denial of the will. Quote 1. Unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. Schopenhauer posits that the pervasive presence of suffering in life suggests it must serve a fundamental purpose, challenging the notion that human existence primarily seeks happiness or fulfillment. He views suffering not as an occasional mishap, but as a core aspect of the human condition, essential to the architecture of life itself. This perspective shifts the philosophical inquiry about life's meaning away from mere pursuit of happiness to a broader contemplation of existential purpose. Quote 2. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt. Here, Schopenhauer critiques the philosophical notion that evil is merely the absence of good, asserting instead that evil has a substantive and impactful presence in life. This assertion challenges more traditional dualistic notions of good and evil, suggesting a more complex interplay where evil is an active force that shapes human experience and consciousness. Quote 3. But misfortune has its uses. For, as our bodily frame would burst asunder if the pressure of the atmosphere was removed, so, if the lives of men were relieved of all need, hardship, and adversity, if everything they took in hand were successful, they would be so swollen with arrogance that, though they might not burst, they would present the spectacle of unbridled folly. Nay, they would go mad. This metaphor highlights the essential role of hardships in maintaining psychological balance and humility. Schopenhauer argues that just as physical bodies require atmospheric pressure to maintain their structure, human psychological and moral frameworks necessitate a degree of suffering to prevent hubris and mental disarray. This perspective frames adversity as not only inevitable, but beneficial, serving to ground human nature and foster resilience. Quote 4. Life is a task to be done. It is a fine thing to say defunctus est. It means that the man has done his task. This view characterizes life as a series of duties or responsibilities, where the end of life, indicated by the Latin phrase meaning he has died, is seen as the completion of one's existential assignments. Such a Stoic interpretation implies that the value of life is in fulfilling these inherent tasks, rather than in achieving happiness or pleasure. Quote 5. The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or, at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. Schopenhauer uses a stark, vivid example of predation to challenge optimistic assessments of the balance between pleasure and pain in life. He suggests that observers consider the acute distress of the prey against the fleeting satisfaction of the predator, implying that suffering is more profound and pervasive than happiness. This underscores his pessimistic view that pain is more significant and impactful than pleasure in the natural world. Quote 6. The delight which a man has in hoping for and looking forward to some special satisfaction is a part of the real pleasure attaching to it enjoyed in advance. This is afterwards deducted. For the more we look forward to anything, the less satisfaction we find in it when it comes. Schopenhauer suggests that the pleasure derived from anticipation is real, but ultimately reduces the actual joy when the anticipated event occurs. This psychological insight underscores a human tendency to inflate expectations, which often leads to disappointment, reflecting his broader pessimistic view of happiness as fleeting and unreliable. Quote 7. We shall see later that by taking a very high standpoint, it is possible to justify the sufferings of mankind. But this justification cannot apply to animals, whose sufferings, while in a great measure brought about by men, are often considerable even apart from their agency. Here, Schopenhauer differentiates between the suffering experienced by humans and animals, indicating that while human suffering might be justified through higher philosophical or moral reasoning, animal suffering lacks such justification, highlighting a fundamental ethical concern regarding the treatment of animals, exacerbated by human actions. Quote 8. Even though Leibniz's contention that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, that would not justify God in having created it. This quote critiques the philosophical optimism of Leibniz, asserting that even if this were the best possible world, it would not justify its creation due to the inherent suffering that exists. Schopenhauer argues that the Creator, being responsible for all possibilities, should have created a world with the potential for greater good and less suffering. Quote 9. If you want a safe compass to guide you through life, and to banish all doubt as to the right way of looking at it, you cannot do better than accustom yourself to regard this world as a penitentiary, a sort of penal colony. Schopenhauer advises viewing life as a form of punishment where each person pays for their existential sins. This grim worldview suggests that understanding life as inherently suffering helps manage expectations and fosters a stoic endurance, aligning with his philosophical Quote 10. Pessimism pardons the word to all. Whatever folly men commit, be their shortcomings or their vices what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and vices that we behold. In this reflection, Schopenhauer emphasizes the importance of forgiveness and understanding toward others, recognizing that human flaws are universal. By acknowledging our own potential for similar faults, we should extend patience and compassion to others, which he sees as essential for coexistence and mutual respect in a flawed world. Quote 11. This vanity finds expression in the whole way in which things exist, in the infinite nature of time and space, as opposed to the finite nature of the individual in both, in the ever-passing present moment as the only mode of actual existence, in the interdependence and relativity of all things, in continual becoming without ever being, in constant wishing and never being satisfied, in the long battle which forms the history of life, where every effort is checked by difficulties and stopped until they are overcome. Schopenhauer describes the fundamental nature of human existence as one of perpetual striving and dissatisfaction, where time and space underscore the transience and futility of individual efforts. The ceaseless process of becoming without achieving stable being reflects his view of life as inherently futile and filled with unending desires that lead nowhere significant, capturing a core aspect of his philosophical pessimism. Quote 12. Of every event in our life, we can say only for one moment that it is, forever after that it was. Every evening we are poorer by a day. Here, the fleeting nature of time is lamented, pointing to a deeper existential sorrow, the unstoppable march of time which consumes our lives. This notion supports his idea that human existence is a series of present moments, each disappearing as quickly as it comes, which underscores the transient, ephemeral quality of life and the consequent vanity of human endeavors. Quote 13. The whole foundation on which our existence rests is the present, the ever-fleeting present. It lies, then, in the very nature of our existence to take the form of constant motion, and to offer no possibility of our ever attaining the rest for which we are always striving. This reflection on the transient present as the basis of existence illustrates why rest or fulfillment remains elusive. Schopenhauer sees life as a constant chase after stability that the nature of time itself makes unattainable, leading to a perpetual state of unrest and dissatisfaction. Quote 14. Human life must be some kind of mistake. The truth of this will be sufficiently obvious if we only remember that man is a compound of needs and necessities hard to satisfy, and that even when they are satisfied, all he obtains is a state of painlessness, where nothing remains to him but abandonment to boredom. In this stark appraisal, Schopenhauer argues that the fundamental composition of human life, defined by endless, difficult-to-satisfy needs, suggests that life itself might be a mistake. Even when one's desires are satisfied, the resultant state is not joy, but merely the absence of pain, which soon gives way to boredom, reinforcing his belief in the intrinsic worthlessness of existence. Quote 15. That this most perfect manifestation of the will to live, the human organism, with the cunning and complex working of its machinery, must fall to dust and yield up itself and all its strivings to extinction. This is the naive way in which nature, who is always so true and sincere in what she says, proclaims the whole struggle of this will, as in its very essence, barren and unprofitable. This quote reflects on the inevitable decline and death of the human body, despite its complex and seemingly purposeful design, illustrating nature's blunt message about the futility of life's efforts. Schopenhauer interprets this as a clear indication that the striving inherent in life, the will to live, is ultimately futile and without true profit or purpose, highlighting a central tenet of his philosophical pessimism. Quote 16. As far as I know, none but the votaries of monotheistic, that is to say Jewish religions, look upon suicide as a crime. Schopenhauer notes the unique stance of monotheistic religions in viewing suicide as a crime, pointing out the lack of scriptural basis for this view and suggesting that the strong condemnation from religious authorities may lack philosophical rigor. This highlights his argument that moral and ethical perspectives on suicide vary greatly across different cultures and are not universally grounded in religious or philosophical truth. Quote 17. Suicide, as I have said, is actually accounted a crime, and a crime which, especially under the vulgar bigotry that prevails in England, is followed by an ignominious burial and the seizure of the man's property. And for that reason, in a case of suicide, the jury almost always brings in a verdict of insanity. This critique of the legal and social responses to suicide in England during his time reflects Schopenhauer's broader critique of societal norms and laws that punish suicide. He challenges the rationale behind treating a person's decision to end their own suffering as a criminal act, especially when such decisions are often driven by rational motives rather than mental instability. Quote 18. The ancients, moreover, were very far from regarding the matter in that light. Pliny says, "Life is not so desirable a thing as to be protracted at any cost." Schopenhauer draws on historical perspectives, like those from Pliny, to underscore that attitudes toward suicide have been more accepting in the past, particularly among ancient civilizations. This historical context serves to question modern prejudices against suicide, and suggests that the act of ending one's own life has been seen under different lights, depending on cultural and temporal contexts. Quote 19. The reasons advanced against suicide by the clergy of monotheistic, that is to say, Jewish religions, and by those philosophers who adapt themselves thereto, are weak sophisms which can easily be refuted. Here, Schopenhauer is critical of the philosophical arguments used by monotheistic religions to condemn suicide, labeling them as weak and easily disputable. He advocates for a re-evaluation of these arguments, urging a more reasoned and less dogmatic approach to understanding suicide from a moral and ethical standpoint. Quote 20. It will generally be found that, as soon as the terrors of life reach the point at which they outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life. This observation about the calculus individuals perform when considering suicide, balancing the hardships of life against the fear of death, illustrates Schopenhauer's view that suicide often results from rational deliberation rather than impulsive or disordered thinking. This perspective challenges the stigma that sees all acts of suicide as inherently irrational or morally reprehensible. Quote 21. When, in some dreadful and ghastly dream, we reach the moment of greatest horror, it awakes us, thereby banishing all the hideous shapes that were born of the night. And life is a dream. When the moment of greatest horror compels us to break it off, the same thing happens. Schopenhauer draws a parallel between the sudden awakening from a nightmarish dream and the act of suicide prompted by extreme distress in life. He suggests that just as the climax of a nightmare forces us awake to escape the horror, extreme suffering in life might drive a person to suicide as an escape mechanism. This analogy is used to highlight how natural and intrinsic the response to end intolerable suffering can be, likening it to a deeply embedded survival instinct, even when it culminates in ending one's life. Quote 22. Suicide may also be regarded as an experiment, a question which man puts to nature, trying to force her to an answer. The question is this: what change will death produce in a man's existence and in his insight into the nature of things? Here, Schopenhauer portrays suicide as a philosophical inquiry into the nature of existence and consciousness. By framing suicide as a question posed to nature, he implies that it is a means through which individuals seek to understand the ultimate effects of death on their existential state and perception. This perspective reframes the act of suicide from a mere end of life to a pursuit of deeper understanding about life and existence, though it paradoxically destroys the very consciousness that seeks the answers. Thrasymachos. Quote 23. Tell me now, in one word, what shall I be after my death? And mind you, be clear and precise. Philolethes. All and nothing. In this dialogue, Schopenhauer uses the characters to explore the complex and seemingly contradictory nature of post-mortem existence through philosophical discourse. The answer, all and nothing, encapsulates the dual nature of death's finality and the continuation of the universe. This reflects the existential duality where individual consciousness ceases, nothing, yet one remains a part of the universal order, all. This duality enriches the philosophical inquiry into what constitutes existence and non-existence, challenging the reader to think beyond traditional dichotomies of life and death. Quote 24. Philolethes. Yes, but you raise transcendental questions, and you expect me to answer them in language that is only made for immanent knowledge. It's no wonder that a contradiction ensues. Philolethes points out the limitations of human language and understanding when addressing transcendental questions about existence and the afterlife. This statement underscores the inherent difficulty in using human concepts and language to discuss or understand things that are beyond empirical experience or observation. The notion of contradiction arising from this attempt reflects the philosophical challenge of discussing the metaphysical with tools designed for the physical. Quote 25. Philolethes, all and nothing. In this terse response, Schopenhauer's character encapsulates the profound paradox of death's finality and the eternal nature of existence. He suggests that in death, one ceases to exist as an individual, nothing, yet simultaneously merges with the totality of existence, all. This statement captures the dual aspect of death as both an end to individual consciousness and a return to a universal state, challenging our conventional views of life and identity. Quote 26. Philolethes. Transcendental knowledge is knowledge which passes beyond the bounds of possible experience and strives to determine the nature of things as they are in themselves. Immanent knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge which confines itself entirely with those bounds, so that it cannot apply to anything but actual phenomena. Here, Schopenhauer distinguishes between two types of knowledge, transcendental and immanent. Transcendental knowledge seeks to understand the nature of things beyond our direct experience, reaching towards the metaphysical or the essence of reality. Immanent knowledge is limited to what can be experienced and verified within the scope of human perception and reason. This distinction underscores the limitations of human understanding and the complexities involved in grappling with concepts like death and the afterlife. Quote 27. Philolethes. It is difficult to find a more precise answer to your question and at the same time be brief. The answer is contradictory, I admit. But it is so simply because your life is in time, and the immortal part of you in eternity. This explanation reveals the inherent contradictions in trying to comprehend the immortal or eternal aspects of existence through the temporal lens of human life. Schopenhauer suggests that the contradiction arises from our attempts to reconcile the finite nature of our individual lives with the infinite context of our deeper existence. This philosophical insight challenges us to think beyond the linear progression of time and consider the broader, more complex dimensions of existence. Philolethes. Quote 28. Well, perhaps I may be able to satisfy you on this point. Suppose I guarantee that after death you shall remain an individual, but only on condition that you first spend 3 months of complete unconsciousness. In this hypothetical scenario, Schopenhauer explores the concept of individuality post-death, blending philosophical inquiry with a thought experiment. He challenges the notion of self and continuity, suggesting that our fear of losing individuality with death might be unfounded or exaggerated. By positing a temporary state of unconsciousness, he invites us to reconsider our attachment to individual identity against the backdrop of eternal existence, stimulating deeper reflection on what it means to exist beyond life. Quote 29. There is an unconscious propriety in the way in which, in all European languages, the word person is commonly used to denote a human being. The real meaning of persona is a mask, such as actors were accustomed to wear on the ancient stage, and it is quite true that no one shows himself as he is, but wears his mask and plays his part. Schopenhauer highlights the etymological roots of the word person to discuss the social masks that individuals wear. He suggests that just as actors in ancient dramas wore masks to portray their roles, people in everyday life adopt personas to navigate social interactions and societal expectations. This observation reflects on the superficiality of social identities and the deeper complexities of individual authenticity. Quote 30. Reason deserves to be called a prophet, for in showing us the consequence and effect of our actions in the present, does it not tell us what the future will be? This is precisely why reason is such an excellent power of restraint in moments when we are possessed by some base passion, some fit of anger, some covetous desire that will lead us to do things whereof we must presently repent. Here, Schopenhauer praises reason as a guiding force that anticipates the consequences of our actions and governs our impulses. By calling reason a prophet, he emphasizes its role in moderating human behavior and preventing regrettable decisions. This concept underscores the importance of rational thought in maintaining moral and social order. Quote 31. Hatred comes from the heart, contempt from the head, and neither feeling is quite within our control. For we cannot alter our heart. Its basis is determined by motives, and our head deals with objective facts and applies to them rules which are immutable. Any given individual is the union of a particular heart with a particular head. This quote explores the origins of emotional and rational responses within individuals. Schopenhauer differentiates between the emotional reactions originating from the heart and the cognitive judgments from the intellect or the head. He suggests that these aspects of human nature are inherently fixed and govern our interactions and perceptions of others, highlighting the dual nature of human response mechanisms. Quote 32. Melancholy attracts, while bad humor repels. Melancholy is a very different thing from bad humor, and of the two, it is not nearly so far removed from a gay and happy temperament. Schopenhauer distinguishes between melancholy and bad humor, suggesting that melancholy has a certain allure or depth that can be compatible with a cheerful disposition, unlike bad humor, which is simply repellent. This reflection points to the nuanced ways in which different emotional states affect interpersonal relations and personal appeal. Quote 33. In all that we do, we wish, more or less, to come to the end. We are impatient to finish and glad to be done. But the last scene of all, the general end, is something that, as a rule, we wish as far off as may be. This reflection captures a common human contradiction: the desire to complete tasks and reach goals, contrasted with the fear of life's ultimate conclusion, death. Schopenhauer highlights the innate human tendency to rush through life's many stages and activities, while simultaneously harboring a deep-seated desire to delay the finality of existence. This contradiction underscores the complex relationship humans have with time and mortality. Quote 34. Every parting gives a foretaste of death, every coming together again a foretaste of the resurrection. This is why even people who were indifferent to each other rejoice so much if they come together again after 20 or 30 years' separation. Schopenhauer uses the metaphor of parting and reunion to explore themes of loss and renewal, likening them to death and resurrection. This observation suggests that emotional responses to separation and reunions are deep-seated and reflective of more profound existential experiences, echoing the human condition's cyclic nature and inherent revivals. Quote 35. Intellects differ from one another in a very real and fundamental way, but no comparison can well be made by merely general observations. It is necessary to come close and to go into details, for the difference that exists cannot be seen from afar, and it is not easy to judge by outward appearances, as in the several cases of education, leisure, and occupation. This quote emphasizes the complexity and individuality of human intellect, arguing that true understanding of another's mind requires intimate and detailed knowledge rather than superficial judgments. Schopenhauer points out that external indicators such as education and occupation can be misleading, advocating for a deeper engagement to appreciate individual differences truly. Quote 36. The existence of the mobsman, or the slave who lives on in this unthinking way, stands very much nearer than ours to that of the brute, which is confined entirely to the present moment. But, for that very reason, it has also less of pain in it than ours. Here, Schopenhauer discusses the simpler, more immediate existence of those living in constant physical and mental toil, comparing their consciousness to that of animals who live solely in the present. This existence, while limited in reflection and foresight, is suggested to be less burdened by the pain that accompanies deeper awareness and temporal understanding. Quote 37. What makes people hard-hearted is this, that each man has, or fancies he has, as much as he can bear in his own troubles. Hence, if a man suddenly finds himself in an unusually happy position, it will in most cases result in his being sympathetic and kind. This observation connects empathy and kindness to one's circumstances, suggesting that people become less compassionate when overwhelmed by their own difficulties. Conversely, when individuals experience relief or happiness, their capacity for empathy and kindness increases, illustrating how personal well-being can influence social and emotional behaviors. Quote 38. The human intellect is said to be so constituted that general ideas arise by abstraction from particular observations, and therefore come after them in point of time. This quote emphasizes the process through which human intellect forms general ideas from specific observations. Schopenhauer points out that knowledge ideally begins with first-hand experiences, which then form the basis for broader, abstract concepts. This natural progression from the specific to the general ensures a more accurate and grounded understanding of the world, as opposed to starting with abstract theories that are then imposed on real-world experiences. Quote 39. Contrarily, the artificial method is to hear what other people say, to learn and to read, and so to get your head crammed full of general ideas before you have any sort of extended acquaintance with the world as it is and as you may see it for yourself. Here, Schopenhauer criticizes traditional educational methods that prioritize the acquisition of second-hand knowledge over personal experience. He argues that learning through others' ideas before engaging directly with the world can lead to misconceptions and a distorted understanding of reality. This method, according to him, predisposes individuals to apply general concepts incorrectly and see the world through a biased lens. Quote 40. This explains why it so frequently happens that, after a long course of learning and reading, we enter upon the world in our youth, partly with an artless ignorance of things, partly with wrong notions about them, so that our demeanor savors at one moment of a nervous anxiety, at another of a mistaken confidence. Schopenhauer suggests that traditional education often leaves young people unprepared for real life, equipped with theoretical knowledge, but lacking practical understanding. This imbalance can result in inappropriate or ineffective responses to real-world challenges, highlighting a gap between academic learning and practical skills. Quote 41. To acquire a knowledge of the world might be defined as the aim of all education, and it follows from what I have said that special stress should be laid upon beginning to acquire this knowledge at the right end. In this statement, Schopenhauer defines the primary goal of education as the acquisition of worldly knowledge, emphasizing the importance of starting this process correctly. He advocates for an educational approach that begins with concrete experiences and observations before moving to general theories, thus ensuring that students develop a solid foundation of first-hand understanding on which to base further learning. Quote 42. No child under the age of 15 should receive instruction in subjects which may possibly be the vehicle of serious error, such as philosophy, religion, or any other branch of knowledge where it is necessary to take large views. Schopenhauer cautions against teaching young children complex subjects that require mature judgment and extensive life experience to understand properly. He argues that early exposure to such topics can lead to deeply ingrained misconceptions that are difficult to correct later in life. By restricting instruction in these areas until a child is older and more experienced, educators can prevent the formation of erroneous beliefs that might hinder intellectual and personal growth. Quote 43. The keenest sorrows and joys are not for her, nor is she called upon to display a great deal of strength. The current of her life should be more gentle, peaceful and trivial than man's, without being essentially happier or unhappier. This quote reflects Schopenhauer's belief that women's lives are meant to be simpler and less burdened by the extreme highs and lows experienced by men. He suggests that the natural order dictates a more subdued existence for women, one that is less involved with the struggles and triumphs that, according to him, characterize men's lives. Quote 44. The natural feeling between men is mere indifference, but between women it is actual enmity. Schopenhauer proposes that women are inherently more competitive and hostile toward each other compared to men, whom he believes are generally indifferent toward one another unless provoked. This assertion is based on his view of women as more directly engaged in a struggle for survival and recognition within the constraints of their social roles, leading to heightened rivalry and conflict. Quote 45. Schiller's poem in honor of women, Würde der Frauen, is the result of much careful thought, and it appeals to the reader by its antithetic style and its use of contrast. But as an expression of the true praise which should be accorded to them, it is, I think, inferior to these few words of Joey's. Without women, the beginning of our life would be helpless, the middle devoid of pleasure, and the end of consolation. Schopenhauer critiques Schiller's poem on women by comparing it to the sentiments expressed by Joey, suggesting that the simpler expressions by Joey capture a more genuine appreciation of women's roles throughout the stages of human life. This quote highlights Schopenhauer's perspective on the fundamental contributions of women as integral, yet often understated, within societal contexts. Quote 46. You need only look at the way in which she is formed to see that woman is not meant to undergo great labor, whether of the mind or of the body. This statement reflects Schopenhauer's view on the physical and mental capacities of women, suggesting that by nature women are not suited for the same types of strenuous efforts expected of men. This perspective is indicative of the 19th century attitudes towards gender roles, emphasizing a perceived natural order that assigns women and men to different spheres of activity based on inherent qualities. Quote 47. Women are directly fitted for acting as the nurses and teachers of our early childhood by the fact that they are themselves childish, frivolous, and short-sighted. In a word, they are big children all their life long, a kind of intermediate stage between the child and the full-grown man, who is man in the strict sense of the word. Here, Schopenhauer controversially characterizes women as perpetually childlike in their mental and emotional development, arguing that this makes them ideally suited for roles such as childcare and education. This view diminishes the intellectual and emotional capacities of women, presenting them as naturally predisposed to simpler, less demanding tasks that mirror their own natures. Quote 48. The laws of marriage prevailing in Europe consider the woman as the equivalent of the man. Start, that is to say, from a wrong position. In this critique of European marital laws, Schopenhauer argues that such laws erroneously position women as equals to men, which he believes is contrary to their natural roles and capacities. He suggests that this legal misalignment leads to broader social and personal complications, reflecting his view that societal norms should adhere more closely to what he considers the natural order of gender roles. Quote 49. Kant wrote a treatise on the vital powers. I should prefer to write a dirge for them. The superabundant display of vitality, which takes the form of knocking, hammering, and tumbling things about, has proved a daily torment to me all my life long. Schopenhauer expresses his frustration with the disruptive and noisy aspects of life, contrasting his own sensitivity to noise with Kant's philosophical examination of vitality. This sets the stage for Schopenhauer's exploration of how such disturbances negatively impact intellectual work and tranquility, emphasizing the personal torment noise brings to those who are intellectually inclined. Quote 50. This aversion to noise I should explain as follows. If you cut up a large diamond into little bits, it will entirely lose the value it had as a whole. And an army divided up into small bodies of soldiers loses all its strength. Schopenhauer likens the disruptive effect of noise to the fragmentation of something valuable, which loses its worth when divided. This analogy underlines his view that intellectual concentration, like a unified force or a whole diamond, is essential for maintaining intellectual strength and integrity, which noise disrupts. Quote 51. The most inexcusable and disgraceful of all noises is the cracking of whips, a truly infernal thing when it is done in the narrow, resounding streets of a town. He vehemently criticizes the cracking of whips, especially in urban settings, as a significant disturbance that shatters concentration and peace. Schopenhauer's description of this specific noise as infernal underscores his strong belief that such disturbances are not just nuisances, but serious impediments to intellectual and reflective life. Quote 52. Noisy interruption is a hindrance to this concentration. That is why distinguished minds have always shown such an extreme dislike to disturbance in any form, as something that breaks in upon and distracts their thoughts. Schopenhauer argues that intellectual work requires deep concentration, which noise disrupts. He notes that many great thinkers have lamented noise for its detrimental effects on thought, suggesting that sensitivity to noise correlates with intellectual capacity, and the pursuit of intellectual activities. Quote 53. With all due respect for the most holy doctrine of utility, I really cannot see why a fellow who is taking away a wagon load of gravel or dung should thereby obtain the right to kill in the bud the thoughts which may happen to be springing up in 10,000 heads. This quote highlights Schopenhauer's frustration with the disproportionate impact of trivial activities, like transporting gravel, on the intellectual pursuits of many. He questions the societal norms that prioritize minor conveniences over the profound potential intellectual contributions of individuals, emphasizing the broader cultural disregard for the sanctity of contemplative and intellectual spaces. Quote 54. In a field of ripening corn, I came to a place which had been trampled down by some ruthless foot, and as I glanced amongst the countless stalks, every one of them alike, standing there so erect and bearing the full weight of the ear, I saw a multitude of different flowers, red and blue and violet. How pretty they looked as they grew there so naturally with their little foliage. But, thought I, they are quite useless. They bear no fruit. They are mere weeds, suffered to remain only because there is no getting rid of them. And yet, but for these flowers, there would be nothing to charm the eye in that wilderness of stalks. They are emblematic of poetry and art, which, in civic life, so severe but still useful, and not without its fruit, play the same part as flowers in the corn. This parable reflects on the value of art and poetry in society, likened to flowers among the corn. While they might seem superficial or unnecessary, especially in a utilitarian sense, they provide a necessary beauty and diversity, enhancing the quality of life much as flowers beautify a field of uniform corn. Schopenhauer suggests that, despite their apparent lack of practical utility, the arts contribute an essential aesthetic value that enriches human experience. Quote 55. The fly should be used as the symbol of impertinence and audacity, for whilst all other animals shun man more than anything else, and run away even before he comes near them, the fly lights upon his very nose. In this metaphor, Schopenhauer uses the fly, an insect that fearlessly lands even on a human nose, as a symbol of impertinence. This highlights a disregard for the typical boundaries or respect that other creatures naturally maintain around humans. It's a critique on brazen or bold behaviors in society, where some individuals, like flies, disregard the personal space or dignity of others. Quote 56. Two Chinamen traveling in Europe went to the theater for the first time. One of them did nothing but study the machinery, and he succeeded in finding out how it was worked. The other tried to get at the meaning of the piece in spite of his ignorance of the language. Here you have the astronomer and the philosopher. This parable distinguishes two approaches to understanding new experiences, represented by the practical, technical focus of the astronomer and the deeper philosophical inquiry of the philosopher. It shows how different perspectives can lead to varied understandings of the same situation, emphasizing the value both of technical mastery and deeper existential insight. Quote 57. Wisdom, which is only theoretical and never put into practice, is like a double rose. Its color and perfume are delightful, but it withers away and leaves no seed. Schopenhauer compares theoretical wisdom that is not applied to a double rose, which, despite its beauty, is sterile. This analogy criticizes knowledge that isn't utilized or enacted in the real world, suggesting that true wisdom must be functional and generative, not merely intellectual or aesthetic. Quote 58. A wide-spreading apple tree stood in full bloom, and behind it, a straight fir raised its dark and tapering head. "Look at the thousands of gay blossoms which cover me everywhere," said the apple tree. "What have you to show in comparison? Dark green needles." "That is true," replied the fir, "but when winter comes, you will be bared of your glory, and I shall be as I am now." This parable of the apple tree and the fir tree teaches about the virtues of steadfastness and enduring value, as opposed to transient beauty. The fir, which remains unchanged through seasons, symbolizes resilience and constancy, while the apple tree, which loses its blossoms, represents fleeting beauty or success that cannot withstand adversity. Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer concludes with a reinforcement of his key themes: the inescapable suffering that pervades human life and the emptiness of worldly pursuits. Schopenhauer asserts that while life is marked by constant striving and discontent, true wisdom lies in recognizing the illusory nature of happiness and accepting the limitations of existence. His reflections on mortality and the inevitability of death highlight his belief that life is ultimately a burden, one that is temporarily alleviated by intellectual insight and philosophical contemplation. The collection leaves readers with a sobering understanding of life's impermanence and the futility of desires, urging them to find peace in resignation rather than relentless pursuit of fleeting pleasures.
Curious to dive into the mind of Arthur Schopenhauer? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Studies in Pessimism, a series of essays, in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.